So I want to talk to you about something that happened in Cleveland this week, and I need you to understand right away. This isn't just a depth chart update. This is the ending of a 6-month war that most people watching from the outside never actually got to see. Let's get into it. Here's the headline everyone's repeating today. Shedeur Sanders is QB1 for the Cleveland Browns in 2026. Simple sentence. 4 words that took half a year to earn. But if you've been half paying attention to the outside noise, the talking heads, the hot takes, the "it's still wide open" narratives that kept getting recycled every single week, you'd think this thing was still up for grabs right up until the moment it wasn't. I'm telling you, inside that building, it stopped being a mystery a long time before the rest of us found out. And what actually stops me in my tracks about how this whole thing went down, is how quiet the announcement itself was. No press conference, no dramatic reveal with cameras circling, and some manufactured pause for effect. Todd Monken walked into a team meeting, told his players who the starter was, and then just moved on to install period, like it was routine. Like it wasn't the biggest quarterback decision this franchise has made in 20 years. And honestly, that's the tell. That's the part I want you to sit with for a second. When a decision gets made that quietly, it usually means it wasn't really a decision at all by the time it got announced. It was just a formality catching up to something the building already knew. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because the story doesn't begin in July. It begins in January, in the dead of winter, when nobody's watching, when there's no beat reporter live tweeting from a practice field, when the only audience for a young quarterback's work ethic is an empty film room and a stack of all 22 cut-ups. That's where Shedeur Sanders chose to live during the part of the offseason where showing up isn't required, and nobody would have noticed if he didn't. He was in that building before the official program even opened, breaking down coverages, building answers to problems that most rookies don't even know exist until camp smacks them in the face with it. And I keep coming back to this one detail because it says more than any highlight reel ever could. When voluntary OTAs rolled around, and I want to stress that word, voluntary, meaning nobody's required to be there, meaning there's zero punishment for skipping it. Shedeur was the first one in the building. More often than not, he was the last one to leave. Meanwhile, across that same quarterback room, Deshaun Watson's attendance was inconsistent at best. Now look, I'm not going to sit here and act like that gap doesn't matter, because it absolutely does. When one guy is choosing extra reps he doesn't have to take, and the other guy is picking his spots, the competition is already tilting before a single competitive snap gets thrown. That's not opinion, that's just how these rooms work. Then camp reps started, real ones, the kind where the ball is live and the grading sheet doesn't care about anybody's story or their contract or their draft pedigree. And one number kept surfacing out of mandatory minicamp, over and over, from every source that had eyes inside that building. 93% completion rate in competitive team drills, 93%. People who were actually in the building watching this in person described him as nearly flawless. And I don't want you to treat that number like some cute stat for a highlight caption, because that's not what it was. That number was the exact moment Todd Monken and Andrew Berry knew, in real time, everything they needed to know before they ever had to make anything official. Here's what really gets me about how this whole thing played out, and I think it's the part that deserves the most credit. Shedeur didn't win this job because his last name opens doors in football circles. And trust me, that name has opened plenty of doors and closed just as many. He didn't win it because a workout clip went viral, or because he's got more followers than half the roster combined. None of that carries weight in an actual NFL quarterback competition, and frankly it shouldn't. He won this job in a film room, at hours nobody was filming, building timing with Denzel Boston, with Isaiah Bond, with Jalen Wallace, rep after rep after rep, until hesitation started turning into instinct. Coaches kept pointing out specific pre-snap checks that genuinely surprised them. Communication at the line you can't fake, you can't cram for the night before. You have to build it through failure and correction, over and over, until it becomes automatic. That's not talent flashing. That's preparation showing its work. And once preparation shows up consistently, under real pressure, for 6 straight months, it stops being a storyline. It becomes a roster decision that basically makes itself. Now let's talk about Watson, because I don't think it's fair to just wave him off, and I don't think that's the story here either. The man put in real work this offseason. Physically, he looks like a completely different player from the guy we watched labor through the last couple of seasons. Healthier, more explosive, the arm talent that made him one of the best quarterbacks in football back in Houston. That's still in there, still flashing when he lets it rip. He organized his own throwing sessions down in South Florida, tried to build rapport with receivers on his own dime, on his own time. This was a man who clearly wanted to keep his job. I'm not going to pretend that effort wasn't real, because it was. But here's the brutal truth about competition at this level. Effort and outcome are two completely different conversations, and this league only pays for one of them. When you strip everything else away and just look at the gap between what Shedeur was producing when it actually counted, in live competitive reps, in mandatory minicamp, in the periods where every single throw gets a grade attached to it, that gap was real, and it wasn't close. This wasn't a rough Tuesday that got blown out of proportion by an overzealous beat writer looking for a headline. It was consistent, week after week, rep after rep, and once a pattern establishes itself that clearly, in front of a coaching staff that has absolutely nothing to gain by lying to themselves, the debate is basically over. The pattern doesn't need a press conference to become official, it just becomes the move. I also want to pull back the curtain a little on what this competition actually looked like day to day, because from the outside, all we ever get is a stat line and a headline. We don't get the texture of it. We don't see the walkthrough where a coach points at a coverage shell on a tablet and asks a 20-something quarterback to identify the leverage before the ball is even snapped. We don't see the install meetings where brand new terminology gets fired at you day after day, and you find out real quick who retains it under pressure and who's just nodding along, praying they don't get called on. And from everything that's leaked out of that building, Shedeur was the guy hanging around after the meeting officially ended, asking the extra question. Not just what the play was, but why it got called against that specific front. That's the kind of detail that never makes a highlight package. But it's exactly the kind of detail that separates a quarterback who looks good in a controlled setting from one who's actually ready to survive against a defensive coordinator trying to take his lunch money on Sunday. So where does that leave Watson? He stays in Cleveland. He's QB2 now, and I don't want you to hear backup and think that role means nothing, because it doesn't. His football IQ, his experience against elite pass rushers, his ability to help get a young starter ready for exactly the disguises a defense is going to throw at him. All of that has real value in that quarterback room. But how he handles this, whether he becomes the kind of veteran presence that actually elevates a young starter instead of quietly resenting him from the sideline, that part is entirely on him now. The organization did their job here. They ran a fair evaluation, they made the tough call, and they've given him every chance to be exactly the kind of mentor this situation actually needs. Now let's zoom out, because I think if you only focus on the day-to-day of a quarterback battle, you completely miss what this actually represents for a fan base that has survived more quarterback disasters than any fan base should reasonably have to live through. Think about the list. Think about every single guy who's lined up under center for this franchise over the last 2 decades. Bridge starters nobody remembers, emergency fill-ins, expensive gambles that blew up in the most public way possible. And then, of course, there's Watson himself, the biggest swing this franchise has ever taken at the quarterback position, the single largest financial commitment in franchise history, and by almost every measure available, one of the most disappointing returns on investment this sport has seen from a quarterback trade in a very, very long time. That's the backdrop this decision is being made against, and that's exactly what makes this moment feel different from every other new starting quarterback headline this franchise has produced. Because this time, the guy walking into the job didn't get there out of desperation, out of scarcity, out of a, well, we don't really have another option shrug. He got there through 6 months of transparent, honestly run competition, overseen by a head coach with zero emotional attachment to either outcome, and a general manager who stood in front of a room full of cameras and said, in plain terms, that a $230 million veteran wasn't getting handed anything he hadn't actually earned back on the practice field. That's a level of organizational discipline this franchise simply has not shown around this position in a very long time. And it's not just the quarterback evaluation that's different this time around. Look at what's actually been built around him. A revamped offensive line that got real investment this offseason. New pass catchers added specifically to give a young quarterback easy completions instead of forcing him into contested 50-50 throws every single drive. A defensive front anchored by a legitimate Pro Bowl caliber edge rusher, built to keep this team in games even while a young signal caller is still learning the actual speed of professional football. All of those pieces, together, around the same quarterback in the same offseason, that combination hasn't existed around this position in Cleveland in recent memory. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's a strategy. You don't overhaul the offensive line, add real playmakers, and invest heavily in the front seven the same offseason you finally settle a quarterback competition unless you're deliberately stripping away every excuse. Unless you're intentionally building an environment where, if this young quarterback struggles, it's actually on him and the process, not on some glaring hole in the roster that everybody saw coming from a mile away. That's a front office putting its full institutional weight behind a decision instead of quietly hedging it. Now, I want to be honest with you, because none of this guarantees anything. Nothing in this league is ever guaranteed, and anyone telling you otherwise is trying to sell you something. But what's been built here, the foundation, the process, the roster investment surrounding it, that's the right groundwork, built the right way. And the player standing on top of it has given this fan base every non-game reason imaginable to believe he's actually ready to build something on it. So what actually happens now? Because naming a starter in July, that's the easy part. That's the part that requires paperwork and a team meeting. The job is his on paper today, but paper doesn't hit back. Training camp isn't some celebration lap for a guy who just won a quarterback competition. It's the beginning of the genuinely hard part. Real pass rushers, guys getting paid handsomely to disrupt his rhythm, coming full speed off the edge for the first time in months. Real cornerbacks pressing at the line with actual physicality instead of the controlled, almost polite tempo of OTAs. Split-second decisions with real bodies flying at him, and real consequences the moment he guesses wrong or holds onto the ball a beat too long. This is terrain Shedeur hasn't had to operate in consistently since last season, and it is an entirely different animal than anything the spring evaluation period could ever simulate. And here's where I think the real answers start coming. The joint practices against Buffalo. Those sessions are going to tell us more than almost anything else before a single preseason snap gets played. Buffalo's defense isn't some tune-up unit you schedule to pad a stat sheet. That's a legitimately physical, well-coached group with an experienced pass rush and a secondary that's going to jam receivers at the line and disguise coverages the way a real functioning NFL defense is supposed to. Watching how Shedeur handles that level of pressure in a competitive setting, not a scripted one, not a controlled walkthrough, that's going to tell the coaching staff, and honestly, it's going to tell all of us watching, a lot more about where this kid actually is than any completion percentage from the spring ever could. I'll be honest, I'll be watching his eyes just as much as I'm watching his arm. Does he still work cleanly through his progressions when a rusher is bearing down half a second earlier than he's used to? Does he trust what he's seeing downfield, or does he start bailing out of clean pockets because his internal clock is still calibrated to a slower version of this game? Those are the tiny, almost invisible details that separate a quarterback who's genuinely ready from one who just looked ready on paper back in June. Then come the actual preseason games, the ones that don't matter to the box score, but matter enormously to a coaching staff evaluating readiness. Real crowd noise, real chaos happening off schedule and off script. The full psychological weight of knowing an entire city is watching every single snap, holding its breath, wondering if this is finally, actually the guy. You cannot replicate that pressure in a controlled practice setting. Nothing replicates it until you're standing in the middle of it with the lights on. But here's what I keep circling back to. Every single time I think through how this story has actually unfolded. The quarterback walking into training camp this week isn't walking in blind, and he's not walking in as some emergency plug because plan A collapsed. He's walking in as a guy who was deliberately developed, specifically prepared, and organizationally backed through the most transparent evaluation this franchise has run at the quarterback position in years. That distinction matters. It deserves to be said out loud instead of getting buried under a one-line headline about a depth chart update that most people will scroll past in about 4 seconds. And I'll give you my honest read on the bigger picture here, because I think it actually matters. That draft slide from 2025 and the one that turned into one of the biggest storylines of that entire draft weekend, that's going to follow Shedeur Sanders for as long as he's playing this game. Whether people say it out loud or just quietly think it every time his name comes up, it's not going away on its own. But if everything that happened this offseason actually translates onto the field, if the version of him that every single evaluator in that building watched and believed in over these past 6 months, from Kurt Warner to Bernie Kosar to Jim Tressel to Todd Monken to Andrew Berry, if that version shows up when the lights are at their absolute brightest, then that slide stops being an embarrassment. It becomes the origin story. It becomes the thing that ends up defining him. Proof that preparation, character, and daily unglamorous investment in the boring work can outproduce whatever a draft card ever said about a guy. And if it doesn't go that way, if the speed of this league proves to be too much, if the mistakes start piling up faster than the growth can keep pace with, if this turns out to be a talented young quarterback who looked electric in a controlled setting and hit a wall the second real football arrived, that outcome is always on the table too. Nobody gets to promise a happy ending in this league, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend otherwise just because I want this story to have a nice, clean finish. But I'll tell you this much straight up. The foundation underneath him right now is real. The preparation behind him is documented, not manufactured for a press release. And the organizational commitment surrounding this decision is more genuine than anything this franchise has put behind a quarterback in longer than most of us want to admit out loud. He earned this, not through hype, not through a last name, not by sitting around waiting for somebody else to stumble first. He earned it through 6 straight months of showing up when nobody was required to watch and performing at a level that made this decision impossible for anyone in that building to make any other way. And honestly, I keep thinking about how rare that actually is in this league. Most quarterback jobs don't get settled this cleanly. Most of the time, it's an injury that forces the issue, or a front office finally running out of patience with a bloated contract, or a coach getting fired before the evaluation even gets to finish playing out. Honestly, this one didn't happen like that. This one happened because a coaching staff sat down, watched 6 straight months of evidence pile up in one direction, and had the discipline to follow that evidence instead of chasing the name, the contract, or the noise pouring in from outside the building. That's not something you see often in this sport, and it's exactly why I think this version of the story deserves a lot more attention than the typical depth chart update usually gets. That chapter of the story is finished now. What comes next, starting with the first padded practice of training camp, is the only chapter that's actually going to matter from here on out. Everything before this moment was preparation. Everything after it is proof.